for this webinar. Just to note a few things as we wait for others to join. Number one is that this webinar is being recorded. You must already have seen a notification, but also that we may be live. Just to note a few things and streaming later on in the course of the coming week. So just be aware. And we want to wait for others that if the one is that this you're also giving us consent to go ahead as such. We're going to start in a few minutes, in the course just enough time for a few more people to join us. Thank you so much. And also, just for those who are already in, be reminded that this is set up as a webinar format. So don't think you're alone on the call. There are at least, at this point, 40 people on the call, including the panelists that you can see. We're expecting more people because we had about 350 people who indicated that they will be joining us. So be assured that you're not alone. All right, again, good morning, good afternoon to everyone who has joined us for this very crucial webinar. We're going to get started and the others can join us as we move on. But before we get into it, I'd like to take a moment to thank the partners who have convened us here this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you're joining from, the African Coalition for Sustainable Energy and Access, the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, Trade Union Capacity Center, the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, the African Resilience Institute, the African Women's Development and Communication Network, and the Bank Civil Society Coalition on Climate Change and Energy, which is an outfit that sits in the civil society division of the African Development Bank. We are grateful that we have the opportunity to have this conversation. I'm going to be moderating the discussions. My name is Eugene Fongwa. I'm the Director of Programs at the African Coalition for Sustainable Energy and Access. If his health permits, Philip Kilonzo, who is Head of Policy, Communication and Advocacy at the Pan-African Climate Justice, will join me in moderating parts of the discussion. Otherwise, you can count on me to get us through. Now, I'd like to start by quickly going through the agenda for the day. It's going to be a very intense moment of discussion. We would want to start first with a few remarks from some of the partners, and then we'll have a discussion to frame the issues and put the conversation in perspective. And after that, we'll have our panel come around to have a conversation around some of the questions that may remain unresolved as we proceed. Towards the end, we will invite participants to join in either by asking questions or by making contributions. And then we'll walk through some of the next steps to tell ourselves how we engage beyond this moment. Now, to get us started, I'd like to invite Dr. Augustine Jamshi, who is the Executive Director of the African Coalition for Sustainable Energy and Access, to make a few remarks. Augustine?
Thank you, Eugene, and thank you everyone for coming. Distinguished guests, colleagues from the civil society, the trade union, partners from the African Development Bank and African Union, good morning and welcome to this critical CSO or non-state actors reflection webinar. Thank you for bringing your expertise and voices to this virtual platform. Comrades, we meet today to reflect deeply on the recent AfDB and AU Ministerial Conference or Forum on Critical Minerals in Africa. As we all know, ladies and gentlemen, Africa holds a massive share of the world's critical mineral reserves. These minerals, like cobalt, lithium, copper, are driving global green transition, something we've always wanted for Africa. Yet our continent's historical pattern of resource extraction without local value remains a threat.
I think we can hear you, Augustine. I don't know. You have muted yourself. Thank you.
We meet today, ladies and gentlemen, to reflect deeply on the recent AfDB and AU Ministerial Forum on Critical Minerals in Africa. As you know, Africa holds a massive share of the world's critical mineral reserves. These minerals, like cobalt, lithium, and copper, are driving the global green energy transition. Yet, our continent's historical pattern of resource extraction without local value remains a threat. I will dare add that resource curse is driving wars and conflicts all over Africa and beyond. At the African Coalition for Sustainable Energy and Access, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that transition must be just, equitable, and sustainable. Critical minerals must therefore power Africa's own development first, not just for foreign industries. We must demand local value addition, strict environmental protection, and communities and workers' consent in this space. Civil society must serve as rigorous watchdogs to ensure transparent mineral governance in the continent. This webinar is our space to strategize, align, and hold institutions accountable. So therefore, let us use this session to turn our shared reflections into concrete advocacy actions. I may want to add that in the recent annual general meeting of the African Development Bank, in which I serve as the chair of the Bank Civil Society Coalition for Energy and Climate, the president held my hand and said, "We need you. We need you, the civil society. We need you, the non-state actors, to work with us so that we can drive Africa's development." And ladies and gentlemen, personally, I feel that it is my strong feeling that this proactive action taken by all of us present in this meeting is just the first step in this direction. I would therefore ask us to reflect deeply in order to contribute and have concrete action points from this meeting where we move from here to participate and direct and orient this critical mineral discourse on the continent. With these few remarks, I would like to thank you, and I will sit here and participate effectively. Thank you very much, Eugene, and thank you very much, our partners, the first trade union, the women's groups, and the other partners that we are jointly organizing this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jamshi. Let me now invite Dineo Majavu from First TUCC to also give us initial remarks before we get into the substance of the discussion. Dineo, if you can hear me, you have the floor. If you're speaking, you are still muted. Dineo? Hi, Dineo, can you hear me? Can someone confirm that they can hear me?
Yes, we are getting you. I think he's having connection issues. He's just left the meeting again.
All right, I think for technical issues, we'll be able to give her the floor when she returns. Okay, definitely she's not here with us anymore. So allow me to start by putting the conversation in perspective so that I can be able to usher in our panel to lead us through the conversation at the appropriate time. Just give me a second. I'm trying to share my screen. Oh, she's here now.
My apologies.
Thank you
As
so
I was
much for
trying
joining
to.
us.
Sorry, Comrade Eugene. I was here. I was trying to open my camera, and unfortunately, it just took me out. My apologies, my humble apologies to comrades. With that, I just want to thank you very much for allowing us to be here as the FES TUCC and to be here in this discussion that is very important. So we greet our comrades, our sisters, and our brothers, calling from the Friedrich Ebert Stifting Trade Union Competence Center for Sub-Saharan Africa. We're bringing warm greetings and solidarity. I think, as mentioned earlier on by Comrade Augustine, Africa stands at a decisive moment, historical moment at this point. The world competes for the minerals needed for the green and digital transition. Our continent has once again become the focus of global economic and geopolitical interest. Yet history reminds us that Africa has often been rich in resources, but poor in development because the beneficiaries of our wealth have too often been found outside our borders. The political question before us is not simply who owns the minerals, but who benefits from them. Will the beneficiaries continue to be the multinational corporations, foreign investors, and global supply chains, while African workers remain, and Africans in general, remain trapped in low wages, unsafe conditions, unemployment, and poverty? Or will Africa's mineral wealth finance industrialization, quality public services, decent work, and economic transformation for our people? Workers must, at this stage, be at the center of this discussion. Workers have to not just simply be part of the labor inputs, but actually be the decision makers and sit in the tables when we are having such discussions. Workers are the producers of the wealth and must have a voice in determining how that wealth is governed and distributed. This means trade unions must participate in decisions on mining policy, beneficiation, value addition, local procurement, occupational health and safety, environmental protection, and just transition. So as the FES trade union competence, we believe that no African country can confront these challenges alone. No trade union can confront this situation alone. No civil society movement. Nobody can do it alone. It requires us to unite and to have a uniform way of dealing with the challenges that we're facing. The race for critical minerals risks dividing us into competition with one another, driving down labor standards and weakening workers' bargaining power. Our response must therefore be one of solidarity within Africa, solidarity within building strong alliances. We must ensure that solidarity comes in the forefront to coordinate our demands, strengthen regional value chains, and ensure that workers and the people of Africa across the continent benefit collectively rather than competing against one another in a race to the bottom. As the FES TUCC, we believe that Africa's critical minerals should not finance another cycle of extraction and dependency, but rather they must come the foundation for structural transformation, democratic development, and social justice, which is very central to the work of the FES in the continent and in the Trade Union Competence Center. This requires organized workers, worker power, building power from the ground, strong public institutions, strong discussions with civil society, and solidarity at the core of the work. So the struggle today is not again about just who owns, who decides, and who benefits. It's about power. It's over the power. Let us ensure that we are not spectators in this process, but leaders in shaping the future. And we're thankful for this platform because it is one that begins the process of us coming together to come up with uniform discussions, uniform solutions, uniform roadmaps, so that we are able to get to the kind of Africa we want. An injury to one is an injury to all, and solidarity should be central to everything. Solidarity forever from the FES to UCC. Amandla.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dinia, for joining us in spite of the difficulties at the beginning. And I'm glad that we were able to partner with you so that the perspective that the trade union brings can be channeled to the other stakeholders that form the non-state actors committee on the continent. We were discussing and highlighting the importance of having a unified front between the civil society and the trade union committee on the community on the continent, because the observation has been that those two communities haven't quite worked together in the past. This is in many ways the beginning of some very good things to come. Now, allow me to continue without turning on my video because of the quality of the internet on my end. And I'm also having trouble with my slides. So allow me to just quickly go through some of the issues that should provide us a context and a background for the conversation that's ahead of us. Most of those issues have already been raised by Augustine and Dineo. So if I do repeat some of those things, it's only an indication that those are critical issues for the continent. Now, the first thing I want to start with is perhaps not something that is new to any one of us, that Africa is a continent that is rich in critical minerals. There is a debate on whether we should call them critical minerals or green minerals. We're going to have that conversation as we proceed, especially with my good friend, Mr. Nkube, on the call, who has worked in other spaces to reframe the conversation to suit the African context. But for the purpose of this discussion, the continent holds approximately 30% of the world's reserves of many of the minerals which are now considered critical to the global economy, from cobalt to lithium, graphite, rare earth elements, platinum group metals, copper, manganese, nickel, and so on. But also, it's important to note that this mineral endowment is estimated at about 30 trillion US dollars, and this is only in mine site value and could be up to 8 times the continent's GDP. So that's quite some wealth. And this is only for what we know. In fact, it's approximate that undeveloped reserves could be as high as 9 trillion US dollars. So there is no doubt that we are wealthy when it comes to these so-called critical minerals. The problem is that this world has never matched the prosperity experienced by Africans. For decades, our minerals have left the continent in raw or minimally processed form. And as it goes out, it goes along with jobs, technology, manufacturing capacity, and profits that are accumulated elsewhere. And this has left the continent structurally disadvantaged in the global value chains. There is also, as we speak, a global industrial transformation that is taking place. The rise of renewables, the rise of electric mobility, energy storage technologies, digital infrastructure, low emission technologies are all reorganizing the world's economy at this point. the electric vehicle and battery value chain alone is projected to expand by from approximately $7 trillion in 2030 to around $60 trillion by 2050. And this means that the real opportunity for Africa is not simply in its mineral endowment, but the opportunity lies in processing, in refining, in component production, in battery manufacturing, in renewable energy technologies, in transport systems, in research, in innovation, in recycling. The opportunity, therefore, is way beyond the minerals that are in the ground on the continent. Now, local value addition is exactly what we hope happens on the continent to be able to capture this value. This refers to, and there are quite a good number of definitions to what exactly local value addition is, but the whole idea is about preserving the socioeconomic value of resources within its country of origin through domestic industry, skills development, and employment. So the central question then for us on the continent is not whether we will supply the minerals that are needed for the global transition, because we are already doing that. So the real question is whether we are going to remain suppliers for other countries' industries to transform, or whether we are going to also use these minerals to drive our own transformation as a continent. The meeting, Ministerial Forum, co-convened by the Africa Development Bank and the African Union and other partners, in our view, presents an important political signal, in part because at that level, the language is also changing. We are moving away from a regime that is based heavily on extraction to a regime, at least in terms of policy ambition, that begins to discuss beneficiation, regional value chains, industrialization, and Africa-led financing. This shift reflects a long-standing ambition of the Africa Mining Vision, of Agenda 2063, of the African Union Commodity Strategy, of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, of the Africa Green Mineral Strategy, and all of these other instruments and mechanisms that already exist on the continent. So the new direction is already emerging on the continent. For us, what is important is not having an ambition, it is translating that ambition into real impact. Because what we have observed so far is that political ambition usually moves very fast and goes too high, but remains locked in and unable to translate into real impact on the ground. And there are a number of reasons for this. The first one is that there is usually very slow on overly state-centered implementation of these ambitions, which are characterized by complex processes and bureaucratic delays. There are also weak cross-border trade issues still existing on the continent, again characterized by not only strong state boundaries, but also poor infrastructure, existing non-tariff barriers, and border delays that may limit movement and markets. There's also the fragmented local content policies. There are inconsistencies in rules and standards, which can reduce investor confidence and local value creation. And there's also inadequate regional coordination, which leads to duplication of work and effort and resources, weak alignment and limited integration, which undermines collective leverage. And of course, there is limited value capture, characterized, as we have already outlined, by raw materials or minerally processed exports that leave the continent, and which means that most value is created elsewhere. The new direction, based on the signals that we're hearing from Abidjan, is that there is need for coordinated policy, alignment of policies and regulations across countries and regions. There is also the need for a more regional approach in investment projects, so that bankable projects that attract investment and build not country but regional value chains. There is need for more accountable financing, which is transparent, innovative, and delivers results and builds public trust. And finally, there is, and I think this is where our conversation will tend to gravitate, the need for measurable benefit for African citizens in the form of more jobs, more skills, more income, more infrastructure, and shared prosperity across the continent. Before we get into the panel, a word of caution that benefication does not necessarily solve the problem. It's very possible that you can have minerals that are processed in Africa, but the ownership and the technology and profits remain external. And we're beginning to see some of that. A refinery may increase GDP while communities near the mine remain poor. We've seen examples of that. A battery plant may create jobs, but those jobs may be unsafe, insecure, inaccessible to women and young people. Industrial development may expand electricity demand without improving energy access for surrounding communities. So benefication is not enough if it fails to deliver real and inclusive prosperity in forms of economic, social, and environmental well-being for all of the continent's people. That said, I'd like to now introduce our panel to delve into some of these issues and share with us perspectives from different institutions, but also from different sectors, to help us understand exactly what benefication truly means for the continent, but more significantly, how we can make it work for the continent. This afternoon, we have 5 distinguished people who are going to speak to us. We have Dr. Marit Kitao, who is Economic Affairs Officer at UNECA. She's not yet joined us. I hope she will join us at some point. We have Elijah Chiwota from Industrial Africa, who comes from the labor unions of the continent and will bring us perspectives from workers. We have Nkululi Nkosila Fanlenkube. I always get it wrong, and I'm sure I got it wrong again, from the African Minerals Development Center. We have Memory Kachambua, who is Executive Director of FEMNET, and we have Apollinaire Zagabe from the Democratic Republic of Congo, who is Executive Director of the Congo Climate Change Network, and who will be bringing us perspectives of communities in mining areas. I'd like us to open the conversation with you, Elijah. And my question to you is quite straightforward. And we're not going to try to follow any real sequence, and allow me to make it as conversational as possible, and expect that I may interrupt you to ask for clarification or nudge you in a different direction so that we can have a more complete discussion. But my initial question for you is this. Now, much of the political discussion around critical minerals focuses on investment and manufacturing. In fact, that's exactly what the spirit of the meeting in Abidjan was. But from the perspective of African workers, what will distinguish a successful benefication agenda from one that creates a new extractive economy with processing plants instead of mines. So nothing changes. What changes is simply that the extraction has moved from mines to processing facilities. What would success look like from the perspective of African workers? Elijah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Eugene, for that question. Yeah, I think most of the points have already been raised by the previous speakers. So beneficiation actually is a process. So it begins with ownership. So issues around ownership is that most of the mining of critical minerals is done by multinational corporations. So they mine the mineral, and then the mineral is shipped to the ports, the pit to port approach, and then it's exported to different countries. So basically, it's raw materials. So there was the point which was made of local beneficiation and the involvement of national companies and so on. So yeah, so domestic capital is actually very important. But at the same time, the point of policy, industrial policies and so on has been mentioned as well. To say what are the policies saying? It's a beneficiation at what level, local addition at what level, and who has the power. So I will give you some examples. In some countries, we have got governments teaming up with multinational companies. For example, some Chinese mining companies and the government of Zimbabwe, they're involved in lithium mining and so on. But what are the benefits that are accruing to the workers and to the community? So there's a power dynamic there around beneficiation. Are we transferring from multinational capital to domestic capital without improving lives, without improving wages for the workers, and so on? So, which is why the industrial policy, mining policies play an important role. And then secondly, it's very common on our continent to say that we have created 2 million jobs. But what is the quality of the jobs that have been created through the beneficiation? Are they informal jobs where there's no job protection, there's no freedom of association, there are no health and safety standards? So what kind of jobs are those? And then at the same time, you get jobs that are 3 months or 6 months. Is that job security for workers to sustain their families and communities? So beneficiation is actually linked, or should be linked, to a lot of other issues, including the formalization of work, so that you are able to start campaigning for a decent work agenda. It is very difficult to talk of a decent work agenda in a survivalist kind of situation where jobs are not protected at all. So the quality of jobs is more important than the count. So even if there are so many jobs that have been created, we should ask questions: how many jobs? What is the quality of the jobs, and for how long? And then the other point around beneficiation has been mentioned as well. The issue of skills and technology transfer. In Africa, we are looking at youth, which is above 60%. And these are the majority. So a lot of reports talk of a demographic dividend. But where are these youth working. Most of them are unemployed. So which means unemployment is very high. So beneficiation should also be talking about yeah, real skills and technology transfer, and which will lead to the employment of young workers. The battery supply chain has been mentioned as well, which is also very important. That there should be linkages between different minerals, whether it's lithium, cobalt, copper, manganese, and so on. Can we have a battery supply chain in a particular region, or let's say within Southern Africa or West Africa, and so on? So there have been initiatives between Zambia and the DRC on manufacturing of batteries, and then there was an agreement which was signed with the United States and so on. So we need to make sure that some of these linkages are developed between countries. There's also talk of the Lobito corridor, which will shorten the export of minerals from the DRC and so on. And then the fifth point that I wanted to make was around fiscal capture, because when you talk of beneficiation, we are also looking at different interests, because sometimes governments are giving multinational corporations tax holidays and so on. And then the same multinational corporations are allowed to violate workers' rights, to disregard environmental standards, working conditions, and so on. So, for example, the pollution of the Kafue River, where the Chinese multinational dam just broke because it was not built according to standards, and then it polluted the river, which supplies drinking water to Lusaka and Kitwe and so on. So these are some of the things to say. Is there fiscal capture there? What are the benefits to the country? Are the tax regimes meant to benefit the African countries? So all these things should be in the industrial policies, so that we don't simply reproduce extractivist models that have existed since colonial times. So worker and community voices should be involved, which means workers must be brought to the table, and communities must be brought to the table. Yeah, I will tell you. I'll give you a short example. When the African Mining Indaba happens every year, and on the sidelines of the African Mining Indaba, we've got the Alternative Mining Indaba. So initially, the trade unions were talking about a just transition, and they were talking about sustainable mining, and so on and so forth. So during the course of these annual mining meetings, corporates started also talking about a just transition. They also started talking about sustainability and so on. So to an extent that the way the terms were now being discussed was very different from what the workers expected when they introduced these terminologies. So, which is why as trade unions, we're always making reference when it comes to critical minerals. We make reference to the ILO's just transition guidelines, because they talk about freedom of association, they talk about collective bargaining as a precondition, and also the fundamental rights at work, social protection, collective bargaining, and so on. Those are preconditions for any mining to take place and so on. So and recently the UN also supported that position by including benefit sharing and beneficiation. So yeah, so in general, this is the what we have been calling for as trade unions, that we must be involved, and communities must be involved, and then the policies must represent the interests of workers and in communities, and that mining must be sustainable. It must not be extractivist, and so on. So in Zimbabwe, for example, there were issues around gender-based violence and sexual harassment. At some of the multinational corporations' mines where they are mining lithium and so on. So all those fundamental rights, including the rights of women workers, must be respected. And then the other calls for trade unions for living wages and so on must be respected. So in brief, that would be my summary, which is also based on what has been mentioned earlier on. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for expanding the conversation. And I'll come back to you with some follow-up questions if the time allows. Just to note that Dr. Kitao has now joined us. I'll allow you to settle in and invite you to speak after we hear from Mkululi. And my question to you is quite simple. It doesn't seem that, like I mentioned earlier, that the political signal is absent. Already on the continent, we have a number of policy, a very comprehensive one, I might say, a policy architecture from the African Mining Vision, Agenda 2063, the Africa Green Mineral Strategy, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. From your point of view, Mkululi, what is the biggest barrier to implementation if we already have this policy architecture in place? And what policy signals from the Ministerial Forum gives you confidence that this time could be different?
Right. Can you hear me, Eugene?
I can hear you pretty well, and I'm sure everyone else can hear you.
That's great. That's great. Now, thank you for the question. And let me dive straight into it, considering the number of panelists and the time that we have. So rightfully, as you have pointed out, the number of policy frameworks that exist on the continent are no longer lacking in terms of what should be done when it comes to equitable resource-based industrialization, right? Which is basically what the African Green Mineral Strategy speaks of. And for the purposes of those who haven't had the benefit of going through the African Green Mineral Strategy, but are aware of the Africa Mining Vision, just realize that the Africa Green Mineral Strategy is an implementation strategy of Africa Mining Vision, targeting these minerals that are deemed as critical in some jurisdictions, strategic in others, within and beyond the continent. So considering that these policy frameworks exist, and of course, as you've rightfully also pointed out, the policy signals from the forum in Ivory Coast demonstrate that policy players as well as civil society are now aware of what should be done, right? And that right there is the move, or should we say, the leverage needed for us to pivot. We are now all aware what needs to be done, right? Civil society now has engagement frameworks to actually work with. And rather than say governments or institutions are not working, they can actually push towards how those institutions can actually work, how government can actually work together with government, right, to ensure that these policy frameworks are actually moved ahead. I will also refer to what Elijah mentioned, and to help indicate how this can actually be moved forward. Elijah is talking about ownership and domestic capital. right? There are frameworks that are aligned to the Africa Mining Vision that demonstrate how that domestic ownership, that capital ownership locally can actually be infused into the resources that are said to be otherwise exported and can now rather be, for all intents and purposes, tokenized and then valued locally and then grow local capital. And in this case, I speak to one particular tool that comes as 2-in-1 called the Mineral Resources and Energy Classification Framework. AMREC, that's the African Minerals and Energy Resource Classification Framework, and the Pan-African Resources Reporting Code that can be used to not only value the assets that we have as minerals, whether they're critical or otherwise, but value them in a way that put them to asset management and then have local companies listing on African capital markets to actually exploit these minerals, extract these minerals. And of course, by so doing, we create downstream players that can actually take advantage of these minerals and this valuation, right? And there then becomes a snowball effect of valued companies, right? Whether they are in extraction, whether they're in service industry, whether they are in those that are actually taking care of logistics, that are taking care of the AfCFTA to move across regions, within regions. And that's how you will then see how all these instruments are tying themselves up and bringing in domestic capital to ensure that the Africa Mining Vision, which itself, for anyone who actually reads it, realizes that it is an industrial policy for the continent, but using our mineral resources. So to come back to, or rather, should I say, to finalize my initial response to the question, it is now time for civil society to join hands with institutions, governments that understand the business of mineral development and resource-based industrialization. Complaining that things are not working is no longer what we are supposed to do if anything is to happen. It is now an issue of ensuring that people on the ground, because we have a multitude of entrepreneurs, we have a multitude of youths that are educated, that are understanding that they need to get things done. But the problem is we are waiting for someone else to be our savior when we are now given the tools to be our own saviors. All these Africa Mining Vision implementation tools are the tools we are supposed to use to create our own saviors, right? And as such, when I say civil society is now ready to do this, even the fact that you have trade unions that are now speaking the same language as what would have otherwise been the language coming from the companies, right? It means we have reached that precipice where we are now supposed to be our own agents. It is no longer something we should wait for other companies to come from. FDI is no longer supposed to be looked at as FDI that comes beyond the shores of the continent. FDI should be an African company investing in another African company. That's the FDI that we are now supposed to be looking at. And that is the level of FDI that all these tools and frameworks can now generate and is able to do it. If the AfCFTA exists and we are not seeing ourselves as investors in cross-border country institutions or cross-border country junior mining companies, then we are not yet ready to actually see these policy frameworks benefit and work for us. On that note, I'll stop for now, and hopefully that actually brings about debate that I can give more clarification and responses to. Thank you, Eugene.
Thank you so much again for adding to the conversation. And what I'm hearing from you and from Elijah are two things. The first being that perhaps we need to stop thinking about benefication or local value creation simply in terms of repositioning in the value chain, but that it includes a wide range of other issues around workers' rights, our right population's rights, around environmental care, and so on and so forth. So it's not simply a question of repositioning on the value chain. So it ceases being simply a technological process and also becomes a governance issue. And the second thing I hear is that our conversation needs to shift beyond where value is created, which I think is how the conversation is currently framed, to also include some very important questions around who owns the value, who controls the technology, who receives the jobs, and what quality of jobs, as Elijah has pointed out, who bears the environmental costs, who participates in the decisions that are made, and who is accountable when promises are not fulfilled. And I think that that broadens our conversation quite a bit and allows us to have a more complete or near complete view of what these issues are. With that, allow me to invite now Dr. Kitao, whom I suspect has settled in properly and must have heard some of the last couple of remarks. And my question to you, Marek, is this. It's interesting that at this point, we do not know exactly what the outcomes of the forum that took place in Abidjan about 2 weeks ago are. But at least we know what the political message is from the conversation we are having here. My question is, if we have to look beyond the meeting itself, do you think that Africa has now reached a genuine political turning point? I think that's something that has already been mentioned, but are we experiencing something we have experienced before, where there seems to be a very strong political signal that is not accompanied by a translation into action? What's the sense from where you sit at the UNF Economic Commission for Africa as you look at the changes in the landscape?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Pretty well.
Yes. Apologies for joining late. I was confused about the time. Sorry about that. I thought it was 3 hours later, but so I did not hear the first speaker, or maybe even before. So I'll frame it as I go. I heard Mukululi. So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak about this very interesting turning point. And I truly believe it's a genuine political turning point. You mentioned the African Development Bank meeting, which we don't know the outcome yet, but it was a very strong political signal. And I just came back from New York. I was participating in the UN Secretary General's Critical Energy Transition Minerals. It was a high-level political meeting. And I had the privilege of being part of the panel when I was at the African Union, and now it was actually a very, very how do you say? I don't even know what to say. Grateful that every producing countries, like the ones with minerals and the consuming countries, everyone was talking about value addition, which was not the case during the panel 2 years ago. So there is, I believe, a real turning point going on, a political turning point, because we're no longer just talking about value addition. We're talking about the how now. It's really about how do we make it happen, not why. And for some of us, like Mukululi and I, who've been in this for the past 17 years since the mining vision, I personally believe that, it's now no longer just about, an idea. It's really about how to make it happen. We know, Muku mentioned, and I'm sure everybody else mentioned about the Africa Mining Vision, the Africa Green Mineral Strategy, which is much more recent. But also the AfCFTA has now is talking about green industrialization and critical minerals as part of its agenda. It's no longer just on trade. So what really distinguishes this current moment is that this no longer centered on whether Africa should pursue beneficiation and value addition. It's about how regional value chain should be organized, financed, governed, and implemented. It's about the real issues, about the jobs. I kind of heard a little bit about you, the first speaker talk about the quality of jobs, etc. It's really about the nitty-gritty on how to make it happen. So regional value chains are becoming a political project. They're not just a technical issue. Now, historically, we have African countries have competed to attract investment into isolated national mineral projects, some of them with contracts that are negotiated in a very opaque manner, et cetera, et cetera. Today, there is increasing political recognition that no single African country possesses all the minerals, energy, skills, infrastructure, and markets necessary to build globally competitive green industrial ecosystems. Competitiveness will increasingly depend on regional specialization rather than just national self-sufficiency. I hear the DRC, Zambia, but even that, I don't want to go into the details, but it needs specialization because now there are two special economic zones happening in Ndola, in Zambia, and in Kolwezi in DRC, but it has to be, they don't have to compete, they have to be increasingly specialization and, complementarity instead of competing. But that's another issue for another day. It's just that to point that, we've gone to that nitty-gritty of the how. And now the AfCFTA also provides the institutional framework through which different countries can contribute complementary stages of production. So that's where your quality of work, skills, infrastructure, what is really the nitty-gritty of what is needed, what is available, the transfer of technology, nothing is done deliberate. Nothing is done for free. You have to think about joint ventures. You have to think about whether with the Chinese government or with the Chinese companies or others. Everything has to be deliberate, whether policy or not some blanket like export bans. It has to be really thought through and see how to leverage that, or have specialized, maybe have an export ban for a certain amount of years, depending on which mineral, and you really need to have a good roadmap. And then you can see, for that, if you do not export raw and then you go with that route on beneficiation, what do you need? The Africa Green Mineral Strategy gives you a very good blueprint, but then you have to contextualize it, whether you're domestic, what are your needs, what are your skill sets, what you need to plan for the next 5-10 years to have as skills, etc. So it becomes really about the nitty-gritty of the details. So this represents a fundamental shift from policies towards like industrial ecosystems, right? So how do we process these minerals, but how do we cannot do it, even if you have to have joint ventures with others, especially China, which currently has most of the technology. And so we've moved from it becoming, it has become an industrial policy issue. I am in a lot of these working groups with UNCTAD, with trade people, everyone, because now we have moved towards industrial policy. Industrial policy used to not be a cool word to have, but not even the West, even the US and everyone else is having an industrial policies. We're back to that. So we really have to see it as an industrial policy issue, not just a mineral issue. And now, for some of us, we've dealt with mining ministries for the past decades, but now we are moving. Talk about the Africa Development Bank. We have to talk about finance. We're talking about bankable projects. We talk about how to finance, because yes, you need all this beneficiation, but there's a lot of capital that is needed, whether it's sovereign wealth fund or blended finance, all of this. So that's where your financing comes, whether it's the AfDB, or you cannot just talk with the Minister of Mines. You have to talk with the Minister of Finance. You have to talk with the Industry Ministry. You have to talk with the Trade. You have to talk with the infrastructure, have to talk also with central banks and other actors, just to say that it has become, the ecosystem has grown. It's no longer just about minerals. So we are also shifting when you go industrial policy and you go on the other side about manufacturing, energy, transition. Infrastructure, I don't know, somebody talked about Lobito, but there are others as well. And you have to talk about the employment. I mentioned the skills, but it has to be, and you have to think about the research, development, and innovation as well. We have to have that in place. I mean, the African Mining Vision clearly states that Africa Green Mineral Strategy also, but now it's about implementing and going down to the level. So again, I mean, we have to talk as Africa as strategic one voice. I mean, we had a bottom-down approach recently, civil society and governments coming together and strategizing on how to have one voice as Africa. Because what AfDB platform can give us, and hopefully it will, I mean, I haven't seen the outcome yet, but it should give us a common principle and convergence around one this value addition that we want, but then it has to be regionalized, etc. And we have to target larger than just batteries. I mean, of course, batteries are important, but there are others, copper wires, lesser ones. ECA is conducting some studies on viable value chains in Africa, and the results are not yet there, but we have to see which are the quick wins or the ones that we can really leverage on to show some result and then move to the next, because otherwise we'll be just talking. So it could be copper refining, lithium chemicals, or graphite processing. There's green steel. And of course, Africa, we need also to link it to food security, but what about fertilizer minerals, etc.? So we have to be nitty-gritty around that. And again, I'm emphasizing financing. The fact that ADB is interested is one of the biggest things, is that it brings financing into the core. Of course, we had Afreximbank, which was very much with the DRC Zambia battery plant, and the Africa Finance Corporation, and Badea, the Arab Development Bank, was involved when Mr. Sidi was the head. Now he's at the AfDB. It's just to say that financing is critical, and now it's a very good signal that AfDB is really into it. So just to conclude, just to say that I believe that Africa is approaching perhaps its most important political momentum in the history of its mineral sector. Because for decades, we have been talking about value addition, beneficiation through the AMV, but now the conversation has fundamentally shifted from aspiration to implementation. The question is not anymore about if Africa should industrialize using its minerals, but it's about how to organize ourselves as Africa and to do it collectively. The momentum has been also, I agree, the ADB one has demonstrated that there's a growing political consensus, and that no single country can industrialize alone. So really, the future I see is happening in regional value chains, etc. And of course, since we do, somebody mentioned benefit sharing, we fought for this benefit sharing during the UN panel, because it's very important not to lose out the communities that are involved, the women, the artisanal small-scale mining, etc., etc. And once you have that roadmap clearly about this beneficiation, that's when all the other factors come in: environmental impacts, displacement of communities. All of these issues will come together, and that should not be relegated as a second. It has to be part of the first round of road mapping, if I should say. Of course, we talk about the technical things, but we also have to think about what is happening on the inside. And this, the UN panel on critical energy transition minerals really emphasizes human rights, environmental, even indigenous people's rights, communities, benefit sharing, etc. So I really feel I think I'm being very optimistic in the last 2-3 months or even more since I have been in this issue, doing these issues, because there's a real momentum, even not just with the ones with minerals, but with the ones consuming. Now they understand that we can no longer talk about these minerals in an isolated. It has to be a developmental led. It can't be just exporting raw and nothing comes back to the country. So I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that addition to the discussion. For those who are unable to see who else is on the call, just to let you know that there's at least 70 of us on this call this morning or this afternoon. It's quite an interesting subject, and we're glad that it has attracted interest from so many people. But also participants, there is a poll that's displayed on your screen. If you can quickly go through and respond to some of those questions, it's going to help us develop a strategy for engaging beyond this conversation if at the end we don't have time for a discussion around those issues. Now let's move to the front lines, and starting with the communities and the segments of the communities that are often impacted in ways that are very disproportionate. And I'm talking about the women. I'd like to invite Memory at this point, who's Executive Director of FemNet. And I think the questions tend to come back to the same issues, because in many ways, these issues are very, very interwoven. And we see that industrialization as an issue is often discussed as a technical, neutral issue. But what we're hearing so far is that it's a very political issue, which means that it's not also gender neutral. In reality, women frequently experience mining differently, as has already been pointed out by a few speakers, whether as workers, as entrepreneurs, as informal traders, or even simply as community members. With this turning point, which Marit strongly believes in, how can Africa ensure that the emerging beneficiation agenda becomes a platform for women's economic empowerment rather than another male-dominated, industry-driven, market-driven sector? Memory?
Thank you so much, Eugene, and thank you so much for organizing this very timely discussion. And I think even as we are waiting for the outcome of the ministerial meeting, I think it's important for us to ensure that there is inclusion as a minimum in terms of being consulted and also being part of these conversations, because we do know that most of the times when African governments are meeting without the people, the civil society, and us, the people at the front line, it just usually becomes a business transaction. So I think my first point is that I think we should make sure that AfDB really ensures that civil society is consulted in a way which is meaningful and not just a way where it's sort of like being, like information sharing, but that we are actually part of co-creating, because we know that we bring in the accountability angle, but we know that we are also impacted. I think from what you are talking about and from your questions, usually when you talk about the just transition, green economy, industrialization, it is usually framed in a very gender neutral manner, but then it's actually not, because we see that when we see this industrialization agenda, most of the times is built on women's unpaid labor, while really concentrating on wealth and ownership. And we know who owns that. These are the oligarchs, these are the billionaires, these are the men who actually, I think Augustine mentioned that we see that where we find the minerals, where we find the resources for this current discourse, is where we find in the wars that are happening. We find so much inequality. I mean, how do you explain that in areas where you have cobalt, you have lithium, the same communities, especially the women in living in those communities are very energy poor as well. So I think it's quite important to ensure that we are bringing this into the discourse, and also noting some of the hidden costs that come with this industrialization, issues around environmental degradation, the gender-based violence, that we see, the informal work, the exclusion from ownership, the displacement, and if we don't intentionally redesign even what you are calling beneficiation, we have to keep asking, is benefiting who within these value chains? Where are we finding ourselves in these beneficiation models? So I think most of the time it's just moving from really exploiting and exporting much of the raw materials. There was mention of the Lobito corridor being a shorter, making it much shorter, but we're talking about making it shorter to take the raw straight to the ports. And I think these are some of the things that we really need to really interrogate. When it comes to creation of jobs, creation of ownership, I think it's important to know for us to always question in terms of technology transfer, to what extent are we actually getting the technology? Who is sitting in these decision-making bodies? I think as Africa, we need to find ways of constantly, financing and finding capital markets within the continent or from the people. Because I think if it's presented in a transparent way, I think we need to minimize more and more and have a way of contracting, which actually ensures that it's benefiting the communities, it's benefiting the country itself. So issues around who is making or do we use a gendered lens when we are coming up with these contracts for these multinationals? It's usually very gender blind. Who's sharing on these profits? Who's sitting on these boards? Even when we think about community boards, do we have specific positions for youth, for women to be there? And also, I think just moving away from women being at the tail end of the value chain, where it's very micro kind of way, but they're actually part of the where the actual money is and where the decisions are as well. I think another one is around redistribution. I think one of the things that we see is that most of, even when you talk about the corporate social responsibility that these industrialization companies come with, they usually just financing a school or maybe a sewing machine for women's projects. And I think we really need to move from that to ensure that there is compensation for displacement, there is retribution to the loss, and that it's sustainable as well, and it's just not something where it's just there to benefit a lot. And I really like what Marit talked about, that I think the realization now is that no single country has all the minerals, the infrastructure, the technology to move. So we need more greater partnership, we need more cooperation. My third point is really around building a economy alongside or within this whole green economy, green transition. I think one of the biggest barriers preventing women from participating in the whole industrialization is really the burden of care work. And we see that across Africa, women perform overwhelming majority of unpaid care work, domestic care, limiting their access to formal employment and also to be able to participate fully. So we need to ensure that the revenues coming out ensure there's universal childcare, there's clean water, education, there's safe transport, and also that the care infrastructure is a priority. Because if we ignore this, the beneficiation will simply reproduce more privilege and more systemic discrimination and barriers. I also want to mention that I think we really also need to ensure that this industrialization and the policies are decolonial, and that we are really moving away from the same model. And I think this has already been mentioned again. But one of the things that we also see is that women's bodies are usually the first extraction sites. So whenever we see tons of our minerals leaving the continent, it's the women who are paying the price when they lose the ancestral land, when there's compulsory acquisition with no compensation, when land rights are not honored. And also we see like with pollution, which and some of the diseases that are coming out from it could be the mining, the way in terms of which the mining is happening, the violence I mentioned before, the trafficking, as well as the exploitation. We can also not talk about critical minerals without talking about conflicts. If you look at Sudan, for example, it's facing one of the world's humanitarian crisis, and it's really competition over natural resources, including gold. And it has become deeply intertwined with armed conflict. Women are displaced, they're subjected to sexual violence, and they're also forced to sustain families amidst economic collapse, while the extractive wealth is fueling other countries. And I think we need to bring accountability to that, as well as to claim and also make sure that this cannot happen. So even if it's Sudan with war, I think as an African body, African ministers should actually come together, and we should be banning and even labeling some of these minerals. Remember, with the diamonds, with the blood diamonds. So also needs to create awareness on what this extraction is doing to us on the continent. Yeah, I think also maybe just to say, we find that, for example, in Zimbabwe, in Bikita, it is one of the largest lithium deposits, but we find that the communities around there, they still struggle with unreliable electricity, inadequate roads, limited access when it comes to development. And this has also been named. I think there's also we also hearing new terms that this is really not transition, but it's actually like apartheid, it's energy apartheid, where we are seeing this extraction in all the countries, in Nigeria, the displacement of women, and who are also resisting some of those pollution to the waters, their fishing, their livelihoods. And I think this has really shows that we need to also ensure that we protect the future, particularly of women human rights defenders. In most cases, they are killed. In some cases, they are also criminalized. So I think just to end, I just want to say that adding value to minerals is not enough if we do not add value to people's lives. And that if we have these multinational companies, if we have these factories that exclude women from ownership, this is not industrialization at all. We need to ensure that we use feminist lenses, we use gender responsive tools to ensure that it's more inclusive, and that it's not development if it's built on land that is stolen, if it displaces the value. But what should a real value chain look like? I think it should ensure that there is care infrastructure, there is investment into the public infrastructure, the water systems, there's renewable energy, and that women actually lead and own the manufacturing as well as the enterprises. So I think we really need to ensure that we keep interrogating this. And I think African women, we have protected the land for generation, need to finally become owners of the wealth that is beneath it. If the critical minerals transition does not dismantle both the colonial extraction and the patriarchal capitalism, then it is not just, and it is simply extractivism and a lot of greenwashing. Thank you so much. Over to you, Eugene.
Thanks so much. And I like how strongly you've ended there with not so much a word of caution, but something we need to pay attention to. Comes across a little like a warning that we would fail if we don't take into account the social dimensions of these issues, especially as they apply to women. And as you mentioned, those who have been stewards of these lands for centuries. And you did mention communities quite a bit in your remarks, and that provides us a very good excuse to move to the DR Congo, which in many ways has been a playground for these issues. One could even say a battleground for these discussions around critical minerals. And I'm glad that Apollinaire Zagabe, who is director at the DRC Climate Change Network, has joined us, and would want to invite you, Apollinaire, to share with us some of the lessons from the front line from the Democratic Republic of Congo, lessons that can help us understand better how best to shape this beneficiation, especially if it's going to be rolled out at scale across the continent. Apollinaire?
Yes, can you
Merci
hear me?
d'être là.
Merci.
Très bien, merci.
Thank you very much, Eugene, for giving the floor. And I'm happy to share about the experience we are witnessing in the Democratic Republic of Congo when in regards to mining exploitation within the country. So, as you all know, DRC is one of the wealthy countries in the world in terms of minerals, but still one of the poorest countries in the world in terms of poverty. It's unfortunately because it's very difficult to understand it. Looking at a country being rich and at the same time looking at a country being the poorest. So the lessons from the DRC, from communities we've learned. So as I just mentioned, DRC is having more than 72% of the world's cobalt. That's based on the report of 2024. But also DRC is holding at least 11% of the global mined copper. And the estimated wealth DRC is possessing is over 24 trillion US dollars, but still more are being discovered. Like in my region where I come from, they are just discovered more copper in some places which nobody could ever think maybe copper could be around there. So the central lessons we are learning as a community in DRC, it's crucial the processing of minerals to be done locally. And what is being done is not enough because almost only maybe 10% is being done in terms of processing. So 90% is being of all minerals are being exported to Western countries. So let me say that a refinery can sit beside a poor community. A battery plant can create export while land, water, health, and livelihood still gets deteriorized. So Africa's main objective should be a shared prosperity. It should be community rights, a decent work, a domestic capabilities, a regional value chain, and ecological security. When all these components are not being taken into consideration, then African community will still remain the same. This I'm giving us some experiences the communities are facing in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And what we need to know, there is need of justice in terms of mining, and the public value must grow where the impacts are felt. So before approving the scale, community needs to ask 4 questions. About 4 questions need to be answered from the community. The first question which comes, who decides, who takes decisions? The participation of the community must begin from the preparation of licenses to the corridor and when plants are being put in place. It's unfortunately, communities from the DRC have not been engaged fully from the beginning of decision being taken till to the end to implementation of these mining agreements. Let me just give an example of the US DRC mining agreement. So it looks to be something crucial beneficial for the country, but community negotiations were invited to take part of these negotiations. So means the countries can get some value, but on the community aspect, I'm not sure that things have been considered in the agreement. So the second question which we can ask ourselves, and we are asking as a community, who benefits from this mining? Are we getting jobs? Or are we how looks the procurement or revenues or the infrastructure? Unfortunately, from the lesson learned from DRC, a country which is being exploited for over decades, but we still face the same scenario whereby revenues are less and there is almost no infrastructure when it comes to mining in mining industries. DRC is one of the countries without roads, but still making the world grow. It's contributing to the world economy, but still a country without almost no infrastructure. It's unfortunately. And then the third question we ask ourselves, who breaks the risk? There is the risk we are facing now in DRC when it comes to the mining companies polluting the environment. When it comes to several issues we are facing, we see the land loss, we are facing pollution and safe work, because like my colleague just mentioned, the type of work we get as a community, maybe you get a six-month contract, and that is called the work for Africa. But this is unfortunately not the type of work communities needs. We need more sustainable and developing environment where communities can access opportunities for job markets, but in respect to the environment. And then the fourth question we ask ourselves, who can enforce these agreements or these policies? Community needs to access the data or information which has been signed, but also there is a need of sanctions to companies or countries that are not respecting the legal framework. Unfortunately, from the United Nations, there are no existing strong legal framework when it comes to the mining exploitation. And this is some of the things possibly we as African community, civil society, and the UN government should invest themselves. I just remember the DRC as chairing the United Nations Security Council this month. They raised the same issue whereby there is no traceability because the mining has been built on conflict and wars. And definitely for the case of DRC, we only, since I was born, I'm only experiencing wars and killings of mass civilians. I have not experienced seen an area where there is a peace within the country. And all these conflicts are based to the mining, to the wealth DRC possesses, because there cannot be a war in a country which is very poor without mining. And this is something, as Africa, we need to stand to request and to call upon the UN Council to build a real strong framework that avoids mining to be linked to conflicts. As you all know, since Africa exists as a continent, or since we got the independence, this is a politics which was built to maintain Africa behind and never progress. So from the lesson learned in the DRC, there is a need to put the right and consent before infrastructure. So even if you bring infrastructure, it has to be adapted to the community or the environmental rights. So if we just build, like, just give an example of how Chinese are building in Lubumbashi, in the area of Katanga, where they are polluting without respecting the human rights. A lot of abuse is happening there. So such kind of infrastructure we don't need. We need infrastructure which are adapted to the environment situation, which whereby the community is not being affected. So the second lesson is the measure of local value and capabilities. It's not only the plant location, but what are these investment or infrastructure bring to us, or these companies are bringing to us? A facility is not a transformer if technology or finance or management or skilled workers remain imported from wealthy or superpower countries. So this means there is a very great need for Africa to have skilled workers, because we all know and we are experiencing that most of the skilled workers being exported from countries, imported from countries or developed countries. And we African, we remain at the same level. So it's another way of making Africa dependent to world country or developed countries. And this is something needs to be addressed. So bringing infrastructure, bringing companies, transforming the mining in Africa, it's crucial, but we need to invest as well in the capacity building in order to build our own task force to make sure, even if when there are no foreigners or no superpowers within the country, that Africa should continue to sustain itself and build its development by Africans themselves, but not always depending on Westerns or foreigners. So unfortunately, DRC is still one of the country which is losing billions every year because of lack of governance or capacity building, or also corruption. Unfortunately, even the existing laws are not being implemented. So as lesson 4, we are learning from the exploitation of mining in DRC, there is a need to build a regional value chain inside the ecological limits. DRC should not only decide as DRC, but there is a need of cooperation, like the colleagues mentioned some program or the different corridor being initiated by the United States. But this is not sufficient, it's not enough, but there is a need to build a regional value chain for more traceability, but also for ecological limits. So in terms of the water baseline, wealth and water, the baseline data, we need the continuous monitoring and public results, and polluter countries enforcement. So we need polluters to continue paying Africa for the damages they are being, which is being done. But also we need at the energy and climate, but also at the artisanal mining, that's the local exploitation mining. No country can build itself. DRC cannot build itself alone without all other African countries as a regional blocks. So possibly I'll give some of the non-negotiable scales of beneficiation, something which Africa should tighten on when it comes to communities. First of all, we need the voice of community to be heard from the beginning. Before any agreement is taken, the community to take part of any decision. And secondly, we need the binding benefits. From the binding benefits, we need to know what has been agreed within any agreement, for what budget, and what's the local development outcome. Those are this second one is also very crucial because agreements are being signed by our governments, but we don't know what's inside and they don't want us to know exactly what they signed. So there is a need of decent work. We need a safety work, wages, salaries, not like being exploited like slaves in our countries. We need unions and gender equity to be addressed within all frameworks. Then we need African capability. The African capability, that's what I addressed when it comes to capacity building, to have skilled worker, technology transfer, research, and finance. It's really paining sometimes when we look at in Africa, there is no one African Research Center. And this is something we are trying to address and to bring initiatives to have the African One Research Center within Africa. And this is an initiative we put in place with the government of the DRC together with our network, the DRC Climate Change Network. But we requested as well the technical support from the UN agency, including UNEP, UNECA. We requested as well the FAO and UNDP. So we hope these agencies will also take it serious because anything coming from Africans should not be neglected because they are African, bring the idea, not the Westerners bringing some things like idea. So no matter how costly it can be, but we need to give value to our continents and have something done on behalf of Africa. So the fifth point is more ecological security. When it comes to ecological security, there is a need of water, health and climate resilience, but as well restoration of land. And the last point, which should not be negotiable, is the public accountability. We need the contract to be known exactly and what's the beneficial ownership and also the trustability. And on behalf of the DRC Climate Change Network, but as well more organizations, more countries are joining us. We are managing the campaign of 1% tax on final products linked to strategic minerals. This is as well something very essential to benefit directly the community. It's not linked to the agreement of Paris Agreement, but it's something we are bringing in, linked to final product linked to critical and strategic minerals for energy transition. This is something where I'm calling every one of us to get involved. And the good news may be it's starting from somewhere. The Vatican also is taking interest to this campaign, and possibly they will join us in this to make sure this campaign runs up. So we call as well any UN agencies or African countries to join in this campaign because it's for communities all around the world, not only for Africa. So that's something which I wanted to share with you about the experience we are having in DRC. It's unfortunately not good experiences we are facing, but only negative, even though DRC is building the world, but we are still being the victim of what we have within the country. Instead of the mining sector to be beneficial for Africans, for the community, is turning as a curse to the African people. So these are facts which needs to be changed, and we request for the implication of everyone and each one of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Apollinaire, and thanks for sharing that experience. I think you have a very unique insight because you live the reality of the issues that we're discussing. And thanks for being here. And stay on if there are any questions for you. We're down to the last 15 minutes of the time that we budgeted for. So allow me take that opportunity to bring in the participants who may have questions or contributions and see how much time we have for another round of final takeaways from our speakers. And while we do that, I'd like to invite Fanyu to project what the participants have identified as priority issues through the poll that was running as the discussions were going on, and we can all have a discussion around what has been said, but also what participants have been able to say through this polling process. So the first question we asked was, what should Africa's highest priority be as we have this conversation? It turns out that many people think local processing, about 39% or 27 participants thought that local processing should be number one priority. Just for the sake of validation, up to 70 people were able to participate in this poll. So that's about 100% of participants, which is really good. Decent jobs came in at a strong number 2, 22 people or 31% of the participants, and manufacturing and then regional value chain. The next question was, what is currently the biggest implementation challenge? Governance and weak institutions. So it turns out that it's not quite a technical problem. And I think it reflects what we've heard in the conversation, more of a governance and a political problem. Of course, finance, about 2/3 or more than a little over a quarter of participants felt that it was a big barrier. And then there were problems around regional coordination, lack of skills, lack of political will, and also infrastructure. There was a third question, are you able, okay. The last one was, what should we focus on in our advocacy based on what we've heard, based on what we know? And community rights is quite at the top. Industrialization, interestingly, is also quite at the top. And I think this is an important signal that our understanding is changing. As someone argued that there's so much talk about development needs to be put on hold, and we may want to talk about industrialization, and development becomes an outcome of industrialization rather than the process and the outcome, the process itself. There is also environmental protection sharing the same weight of priority as industrialization. Transparency, still very governance-related issues. And then down the chart, you have regional value chains, benefit sharing, gender inclusion, decent work and labor rights, energy access, and social dialogues. This as a poll only provides us with an idea of where we can start our work in engaging these processes as non-state actors. but it might not give us a complete picture because the questions themselves were very limited in scope. And it's very possible that there are other issues that have not come up. So continuing with these discussions and having more reflections will help us really understand what the critical issues are and how well we should go about it. So I'm going to now turn the floor to the panel, to the participants to quickly, if you have a question, feel free to talk not only around the issues you've heard, but also the outcome of this poll. And we should be able to have everyone participate. All you need to do is to raise your hand, and our IT team would unmute your microphone. If you cannot, then type in the chat section, or the Q&A section, I think is now activated. You can also type in there. Now, as we wait, just to save on time, let me summarize what, in my view, seems to be coming up as the top line messages from our conversation so far. And again, in the discussions, you want to take into account that as well. Let me find my notes. Anyone? I'm looking for my notes, so I'll keep the floor open for anyone who wants to come in. Otherwise, I'm going to invite our panelists to give us a final take. We have about 8 minutes left before we go to those emerging messages and the next steps. We're going to go in the reverse order this time, starting with Apollinaire, who just spoke. In 30 seconds to 1 minute, if you can, Apollinaire.
Thank you very much. The most important things for now, we have the African mining strategy. But also based on the African aspect and community aspect. So I would request that the African strategy should not be just a theoretical, we should make it more practical. So we are able to encourage more the mineral to be processed in Africa, not always to be sent outside as raw material, like it used to be decades, hundreds of years, which is still the same politics which is going on. So we need, at least we African, as I mentioned, to build a regional bloc to encourage our countries, our governments to take right decision, not based on their own interests. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Memory?
Thank you so much, Eugene. I think for me is to just say we need to center communities, we need to center civil society in all these platforms and in crafting the Africa agenda, because we are at the center of implementation. We need to use scorecards in terms of issues around land ownership, land displacement, that the benefits should actually go first and foremost, and it should be as a minimum in all the contracts and in everything. And also we should be looking at how we can decrease unpaid care work, and also looking into the issues around violence and reparative justice as well. Yeah, so I think for me it's to center African women and girls in all this, and to also use examples like Botswana, recently, where mineral wealth can be governed differently through long-term public stewardship and investment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It would really have been wonderful to have someone for Botswana to share their experience, which would have been a very different experience from that of the DR Congo. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible to get someone. Hopefully next time we'll get someone. They have a wonderful story to tell. Marit?
Yeah, thank you very much. It was quite interesting to hear the perspective, especially from the communities in the DRC and the women perspective. So as we fight for this value addition, and I'm glad that now industrialization and value addition is seen as a development issue. It is actually a development issue, but of course we have to be mindful that the communities around the mines, the women, artisanal small-scale miners, and everyone else need to be considered as a rights holder, but also for empowering them. And when we discuss this at the highest level, we, especially with the UN, it's really is one of the, if you see the UN principles, the 7 principles, the first 3 are about human rights. Then comes value addition. So it's just that it's not, but we have to be mindful, and I'm glad the DRC spoke about that. And I had the privilege to be in that Security Council meeting you mentioned on the link to conflict. And we have to really be mindful that these issues are very much intertwined. And when we negotiate on value addition, we really, in that panel, there were indigenous people represented and there were others, but if they're not, all of us should be mindful of that. And I agree with the memory that sometimes we do have blind spots, and we learn through time to consider these ones as we talk. Environment is usually they have very good advocates, but the women, the artisanal small-scale miners don't. So I'm really happy that we have discussed this, and it should be, and we will bring those voices also at the fore going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marit. Kululili?
Thank you. I would be the broken record here that will constantly refer to the fact that we now have these policy frameworks that by and large do support everything we're talking about, do support moving forward because of this turning point. And what we now need to do is to at least familiarize ourselves with them. We find ways of ensuring that even the grassroots people understand these frameworks. And I know this is the power of civil society. And I'm hoping as part of this turning point, civil society does help us get these frameworks on the ground and to have everyone implementing with the same level of enthusiasm from policymakers to the communities, to everyone else who's affected by resource extraction.
Thank you so much, Elijah. Oh. Sorry, I interrupted you because for a moment I missed you, but Elijah, you have the floor. The very last sentence from we didn't quite get, but Elijah, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I'll end up with emphasis on the opportunity for critical minerals to be used as a resource for the implementation of a decent work agenda, workers' rights, fundamental rights at work, social protection, job creation, and so on. So it's an opportunity to say that those multinational corporations or domestic capital that are investing in critical minerals must consider the decent work agenda, because workers come from families and communities, and they have a contribution to make to their families and communities in terms of livelihoods and so on, and also to take their communities out of poverty. So the work has to be decent. Then the second point will be the formalization of informal work, especially with reference to artisanal and small-scale mining. In Zimbabwe and the DRC, a lot of artisanal and small-scale miners are involved in the mining of critical minerals. So So they also need decent working conditions and so on. So yeah, decent working conditions comes from formalization. Yeah, and I also want to take this opportunity to thank all, especially on the development component, where most of the speakers emphasize that this is an opportunity to use Africa's minerals for the development of the continent is according to the African Mining Vision. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, and thank you to our speakers for your time. I know we did contact most of you at very short notice, so we're really, really grateful that you were able to accept our invitation and speak. Just to note that we had a 100% response rate from our speakers, which is very unlikely these days when people are very busy, especially when you contact them at short notice. We wanted to take advantage of the timing so that we do not hold this conversation too distant away from the forum that took place in Abidjan. We are coming to an end, and I'd like to summarize the best I can in 2 minutes, and if we have 2 more minutes, we can discuss the next steps. What we have heard and what seems to be emerging is that we must think about beneficiation a little more broadly. So it's not simply about adding value in Africa, but it has to include issues around creating jobs and wealth and catering for the interest of all parties, especially frontline communities, and particularly women, who are impacted often very negatively and who also are often left on the margins of the benefits that accrue from these processes. The second thing that seems to be emerging is that we need to start thinking about regionally in terms of strengthening intra-African linkages so that value chains are understood across borders and not simply within borders. And there are indicators and examples that this kind of thinking is already taking shape in some parts of the continent, even if in their very early stages. Thirdly, that we need to position critical minerals as a driver for industrialization on the continent. You can call it green industrialization, you can call it sustainable industrialization, but at least it should be able to build competitive industries that transform African economies and reposition Africa within the global system in the emerging shifts, technology, climate-related shifts, energy-related shifts, etc. Finally, that there is strong need for financing that's preferably African-led, so that it reduces dependency, but also enhances the sovereignty of African countries to design and implement policies without needing to be driven from outside, as it seems to be the case now. And finally, that African ownership is vital, whether it's in policy designs, whether it's in investment, in participation, in all forms that ownership can be described. African ownership is going to be vital. So in a nutshell, that in 5 points is my summary of the discussion. I know there are lots of things that I must have left out. There are nuances that I may not have captured, but I think that as we prepare the report of this webinar, we'll be able to be a lot more faithful to the discussion than I have been in these few minutes. Now, what do we do next? I'm just going to share some ideas that we have, since we don't have time, is that out of this discussion, we were thinking that we would develop some kind of position paper it might not necessarily be a position paper at this end, but start a process that leads to a position paper, maybe from at this point, a discussion paper, an issues paper that helps us to capture all of the issues that have come up during this discussion, and through further engagement, help us to arrive at a position that can now inform a position paper that takes into account the multiple interests of the stakeholders that are part of this process. But in the immediate instance, we wanted to take advantage of the timing to submit some recommendations to the African Development Bank, especially as they are still preparing the outcome document of the forum. And that will be done in the next couple of days based on the conversations we've had. There are a number of issues that have emerged that can actually already form some of these important recommendations while we prepare a stronger position on these issues. But more significantly for the long term is the possibility of establishing an African non-state actors working group on critical minerals that would convene more of these discussions, that would lead the research, but that will also serve as an accountability structure to hold those who hold decision powers accountable for the choices they make, but also to elevate the voices of frontline communities and do all of the kinds of things that non-state actors do. And that group, the promise is that we will convene as soon as the conveners of this meeting have met to debrief and expand it to other players in our sector. From my end, that's where we stand, and that's what brings us to the close of our webinar. But for political reasons, let me allow Augustine to formally close the session.
For political reasons, really.
I want to.
Thank you very much, dear Eugene, and the technical team, the conveners, the co-conveners of this meeting. I think I have learned a lot throughout the 2 hours. One thing I'm left with as a key take-home message is that the thirst or the appetite for engagement in the non-state actors on this very important and critical topic called the critical minerals is here. On the other hand, as I said from the beginning, I received a mail from the African Development Bank. Because of the short notice, they could not be here to give the conclusions of the forum, but that they are eagerly awaiting for the outcomes of our meetings. And as Eugene suggested, we could also already be thinking of some recommendations. I don't know how you go about it, Eugene, with your partners, but let's have some form of recommendations based on the chart that we presented and other issues that have been recommended by the specialists or the panelists and the floor. Let's have something to already give to African Development Bank as we start with the process of discussion paper, which will become an issue paper, and then finally a position paper. I think a position paper will come out of the group. That is the African non-state actors working group on critical minerals that you, the conveners, have thought of very well. And so, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Africa is our Africa. And I liked something that was talked about by Nkulili Kube. He said, this is not the time for us to complain. This is the time for us to take our seat at the table. Guys, ladies and gentlemen, comrades, let's take it. In fact, in my mind, we have taken it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and bye to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Ciao.
Bye-bye.